The weapon was small. So small, in fact, that most German soldiers wouldn't have called it a weapon at all. It didn't roar. It didn't punch through armor. It didn't decide battles, stop offensives, or change the course of the war. And yet, it existed, quietly, awkwardly, inside the American arsenal. Not to dominate the battlefield. Not to terrify the enemy. But to confuse, annoy, and occasionally embarrass them. This was not a weapon designed to win wars. It was designed to surprise. During World War II, both sides invested enormous resources into creating machines of destruction. Tanks grew heavier. Aircraft grew faster. Artillery grew louder. Every innovation aimed to overwhelm the enemy with firepower, speed, and scale. But alongside these obvious tools of war, there existed an entirely different category of weapons, ones meant for moments when everything else had already gone wrong. Captured soldiers. Downed pilots. Saboteurs behind enemy lines. In those moments, survival depended less on power and more on opportunity. And that is where this weapon belonged. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a standard piece of American footwear. Leather upper. Rubber sole. Laces tied in a familiar way. To a German soldier inspecting prisoners or fallen equipment, it would have seemed completely ordinary. Maybe even boring. That was the point. Hidden inside the heel was a single-shot firearm, small, crude, and deliberately unimpressive. Not a pistol. Not a revolver. Not even something meant for sustained use. Just one shot. Enough for a distraction. Enough to disable someone at close range. Enough to create an opening. The Americans called it a shoe gun, though officially it went by more forgettable designations. It was never meant to be famous. It wasn't issued widely. Most American soldiers never saw one, let alone carried it. But German intelligence became aware of it. And their reaction wasn't fear. It was dismissal. From a German military perspective, the shoe gun represented something irritating rather than dangerous. It violated expectations. It complicated procedures. It forced soldiers to think about things they didn't want to think about. Was every shoe just a shoe? Was every prisoner truly unarmed? The German army prized discipline, order, and predictability. Weapons were supposed to look like weapons. Threats were supposed to be obvious. This thing didn't fit. It wasn't powerful enough to worry about tactically. It wasn't reliable enough to respect technically. And it certainly wasn't honorable enough to admire culturally. If anything, it felt juvenile. A trick. And German soldiers did not appreciate tricks. To understand why this weapon existed at all, it helps to understand who it was for. The shoe gun was never intended for frontline infantry. Carrying it into open combat would have been pointless. One shot, poor accuracy, awkward access, it offered no real advantage. Instead, it was designed for very specific people in very specific situations. Pilots shot down behind enemy lines. Operatives conducting sabotage missions. Agents expected to be captured rather than fight. For them, the weapon was not about combat. It was about control, specifically, reclaiming control in the one moment when the enemy assumed you had none. When you are searched. When you are guarded casually. When your captors stop paying attention. That single moment of surprise could mean escape. Or at least, resistance. German forces were well aware that Allied intelligence agencies were creative. They had already encountered hidden compasses, concealed maps, escape kits disguised as everyday objects. But a firearm hidden in a shoe felt excessive and unnecessary. From their point of view, it was a solution looking for a problem. After all, how often would someone realistically get the chance to use it? You'd have to be captured. Then left alive. Then not thoroughly searched. Then placed in a situation where you could access your shoe unnoticed. The odds were slim. And German soldiers knew it. So when intelligence briefings mentioned the possibility of concealed weapons, including footwear-based devices, the reaction was rarely alarm. It was annoyance. Because now, something else had to be checked. German manuals and training emphasized efficiency. Prisoners were searched quickly. Equipment was catalogued. Personal items were removed. Adding footwear inspection slowed things down. Untying boots. Examining heels. Looking for irregular weight or construction. For a weapon that almost never appeared, this felt like wasted effort. Many soldiers simply ignored the warning. Others complied half-heartedly. Some joked about it. And that attitude, half dismissive, half irritated, summed up Germany's relationship with the shoe gun perfectly. They didn't fear it. They didn't respect it. They just wished it didn't exist. From an engineering standpoint, the shoe gun was unimpressive by design. It was typically a smooth-bore, single-shot mechanism embedded into the heel of a specially manufactured shoe. The caliber was small, often something like .22 or a similarly compact round. Accuracy was poor. Range was minimal. Reloading was impractical. Firing it required an awkward movement, lifting the foot, angling it precisely, and triggering the mechanism, often by striking the heel against the ground or manipulating a hidden switch. This was not a weapon for precision or control. It was a last resort. German weapons designers, who prided themselves on mechanical excellence, likely saw it as crude. Compared to the finely engineered pistols and submachine guns Germany produced, the shoe gun felt almost insulting. As if America was saying, this doesn't need to be good. It just needs to exist. And that, more than anything, explains the dislike. The shoe gun represented a philosophy of warfare that clashed with German military culture. It embraced improvisation. It accepted imperfection. It prioritized surprise over strength. Germany, especially early in the war, believed in decisive force, clean execution, and technological superiority. A hidden, unreliable, single-shot shoe weapon didn't fit that worldview. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't elegant. It was inconvenient. Yet, despite the dismissal, the weapon did its job not by being used often, but by forcing the enemy to think about it. Every warning bulletin. Every training note. Every mention in intelligence reports. That was time and attention spent on something that almost never mattered. Which, in a strange way, made it effective. Not as a gun, but as an idea. By the middle of the war, Germany was fighting on multiple fronts, stretched thin, resources strained, morale pressured. The last thing soldiers wanted was another hypothetical threat to worry about. Another thing to check. Another rule to follow. And here was this ridiculous little American invention, hiding in something as mundane as a shoe, demanding attention far beyond its actual capability. It wasn't dangerous. It was distracting. And that might have been the point all along. This weapon was never going to change the war. It wasn't supposed to. It existed in the margins, in the grey area between captivity and escape, between surrender and resistance. Germany didn't take it seriously. But they couldn't completely ignore it either. And that tension, between dismissal and obligation, is what made the shoe gun so uniquely irritating. The shoe gun almost never appeared in the field. That was the strange thing about it. German soldiers were warned about it. Intelligence notes mentioned it. Training briefings referenced concealed weapons hidden in personal items. Yet very few German troops ever actually encountered one. For most soldiers, the shoe gun existed only as a rumor, an abstract possibility, a footnote buried among far more pressing concerns. And yet, the warnings remained. That alone was enough to irritate people. Because in wartime, attention is a limited resource. Every new instruction competes with survival. German training emphasized repetition and clarity. Soldiers were drilled to recognize enemy weapons instantly. Pistols looked like pistols. Rifles looked like rifles. Knives looked like knives. The battlefield, in theory, was supposed to be readable. The shoe gun disrupted that logic. It suggested that even after disarming a prisoner, removing their equipment, and taking away anything that looked dangerous, something else might still remain. Not visible. Not obvious. Not intuitive. And German doctrine did not appreciate uncertainty. As the war progressed, German forces captured increasing numbers of Allied personnel, pilots shot down over Europe, paratroopers separated from their units, commandos operating behind the lines. Each capture followed a routine. Search the body. Remove weapons. Confiscate documents. Secure the prisoner. Footwear, traditionally, was low priority. Boots were boots. Shoes were shoes. Until they weren't. Intelligence bulletins circulated among German units, particularly those responsible for prisoner handling. These bulletins didn't exaggerate the shoe gun's effectiveness. In fact, they often described it plainly, a single-shot concealed firearm with limited range. There was no panic language. No urgent tone. Just a quiet note that such devices could exist. And that, in a way, made it worse. Because now soldiers had to decide how seriously to take it. Some units responded by adding footwear checks to their procedures. Others didn't. Not because they were careless, but because the risk felt theoretical. Soldiers were already overwhelmed with rules. Check pockets. Check belts. Check collars. Check linings for hidden papers. Check mouths for poison capsules. Adding shoes to that list felt excessive. Especially when no one had ever seen one. Among German troops, especially veterans, the shoe gun became something of a joke. A symbol of Allied over-engineering. A clever trick that would never matter. The kind of thing intelligence officers worried about, but frontline soldiers rolled their eyes at. It wasn't that Germans believed Americans incapable of cleverness. It was that this cleverness felt misplaced. There was also a cultural element at play. German military tradition valued directness. Weapons were meant to be wielded openly. Even deception had structure, camouflage, feints, false movements. A gun hidden in a shoe felt sneaky in the wrong way. Not tactical. Just silly. That perception mattered. Because how soldiers feel about a threat determines how seriously they treat it. When something feels absurd, it invites shortcuts. And shortcuts are dangerous, but they're also human. Most German soldiers who heard about shoe guns likely assumed the warning applied to special cases. Spies. Saboteurs. Elite operatives. Not ordinary pilots. Not exhausted infantrymen. Not terrified prisoners. So while the warning existed, it was mentally filed away under unlikely. Which is exactly where the shoe gun lived. The irony is that the weapon's lack of use was part of its design philosophy. It wasn't meant to be common. If it were, German soldiers would have adapted quickly. Procedures would have changed. Searches would have become more thorough. The surprise factor would disappear. Instead, the shoe gun hovered in uncertainty. Rare enough to be dismissed. Real enough to be mentioned. That balance was intentional. German counterintelligence units were far more aware of the weapon than frontline troops. They understood the broader strategy behind concealed escape tools. Maps hidden in clothing. Compasses disguised as buttons. Razor blades sewn into hems. The shoe gun was part of that ecosystem. But even among professionals, it was not seen as a priority threat. Escape attempts were more likely to involve bribery, deception, or environmental exploitation than a single hidden shot. So again, annoyance, not fear. There is little evidence that shoe guns were ever responsible for significant casualties among German forces. No famous incidents. No documented shootouts. No after-action reports detailing serious damage. That absence speaks volumes. And German soldiers noticed it too. If something truly mattered, they would have heard about it. They didn't. What they did experience was the administrative burden. Orders that said, check footwear if possible. Briefings that mentioned concealed devices. superiors reminding them of enemy ingenuity. All without tangible payoff. In the mind of a soldier already under stress, this felt like busy work. It also clashed with battlefield reality. Searching footwear thoroughly takes time. Time during which other prisoners might move. Time during which attention is divided. Time during which something else could go wrong. In chaotic environments, collapsing fronts, retreating units, encirclements, priorities narrowed sharply. The shoe gun did not make the cut. This disconnect between intelligence theory and field reality widened as the war dragged on. German units became increasingly stretched. Supplies dwindled. Replacements arrived with less training. Morale fluctuated wildly. In that context, the idea of a hidden shoe firearm felt increasingly irrelevant. Almost insulting. And yet, the warnings never fully disappeared. They lingered in documents. In training manuals. In the institutional memory of the army. Like an itch that never quite went away. That lingering presence created a subtle psychological effect. Not fear, irritation. The sense that the enemy was wasting your time. That they were forcing you to consider absurd possibilities instead of focusing on real threats. That alone can affect morale. From the American perspective, this reaction was acceptable. The shoe gun was never expected to produce dramatic results. Its success was measured differently. Did it force the enemy to adjust procedures? Did it create uncertainty? Did it occupy mental space? In that sense, even German annoyance counted as a win. There's a reason intelligence agencies invest in tools that are unlikely to be used. Because the threat of use can be just as valuable. The shoe gun existed as a possibility. And possibilities shape behavior. German soldiers, consciously or not, had to account for it. Even if only occasionally. Even if begrudgingly. And every time they did, it reinforced the weapon's strange power. Not physical. Psychological. By this point in the war, Germany was already facing far more serious problems. Allied bombing campaigns intensified. Fronts collapsed faster than they could be stabilized. Resources ran thin. Against that backdrop, the shoe gun was laughably minor. Which made it even more frustrating that it couldn't be entirely ignored. It was the definition of an annoyance. Too small to matter. Too persistent to forget. And that dynamic, a weapon that demanded attention disproportionate to its impact, perfectly encapsulated why German forces disliked it. Not because it was dangerous, but because it complicated an already brutal reality. By late war, many German soldiers had stopped taking the warning seriously at all. Some never had. Others simply no longer cared. And yet, the shoe gun remained part of the Allied toolkit, quietly, stubbornly, unimpressively present. Waiting for a moment that might never come. From the outside, the shoe gun looked like a failure. It wasn't reliable. It wasn't powerful. It wasn't widely used. And it almost never appeared in combat reports. If judged by traditional military standards, it barely qualified as a weapon at all. But that judgment assumes it was designed for traditional warfare. It wasn't. The shoe gun came from a mindset fundamentally different from that of conventional armies. It wasn't born on a battlefield or in a weapons factory focused on mass production. It came from intelligence circles. Specifically, from the belief that war wasn't only about firepower, it was also about disruption, psychology, and exploiting moments of complacency. The Americans didn't invent the idea of concealed weapons. That concept had existed for centuries. But they refined it for modern, industrialized war. And they did so with a clear understanding most such tools would never be used. That wasn't a flaw. That was the expectation. American intelligence organizations, particularly those involved in special operations, accepted something most armies struggled with. Inefficiency. Not every tool needed to justify itself statistically. Not every device needed a clear record of success. Some tools existed purely to increase the number of possible outcomes in a situation. The shoe gun was one of those. From a planning perspective, it fit into a broader ecosystem of escape and evasion equipment. Hidden maps printed on silk. Compasses disguised as buttons. Currency sewn into clothing seams. Lockpicks concealed in everyday objects. Most of these items were never used. But when they were needed, they were invaluable. The shoe gun occupied a very specific niche. It was not intended to overpower guards. It was not intended to fight through enemy lines. It was not intended to kill. Its purpose was momentary advantage. A distraction. A shock. A brief reversal of control. American designers understood that escape attempts were fragile. They often hinged on seconds. A guard looking away. A door left unlocked. A moment of confusion. The shoe gun existed to create that moment. Not reliably. Not consistently. But possibly. This emphasis on possibility explains why the weapon was deliberately unimpressive. A more powerful firearm would have required larger dimensions. More ammunition would have increased weight and detection risk. Greater complexity would have increased failure rates. Simplicity mattered. One shot. Minimal moving parts. Crude construction. If it failed quietly. If it worked just long enough. From the American point of view, the shoe gun was never meant to be respected. It was meant to be overlooked. If German soldiers laughed at it, that was acceptable. If they dismissed it, even better. Because dismissal creates vulnerability. There is a tendency to judge weapons by their best-case scenarios. The shoe gun cannot survive that test. But intelligence tools are judged differently. They are evaluated by how they influence enemy behavior. Did the enemy adjust procedures? Did they spend time thinking about it? Did it add friction to their operations? By those standards, the shoe gun succeeded. Even German annoyance was data. If something irritated soldiers, it meant it was present in their mental space. It meant they were aware of it. An awareness, even negative, changes behavior. The Americans also understood something else. German soldiers were pragmatic. If a threat didn't materialize, they would stop respecting it. And that was fine. The shoe gun wasn't designed to trap them into permanent caution. It was designed to exploit brief lapses. The weapon's rarity was intentional. Issuing it widely would have destroyed its value. The moment it became common, German forces would have adapted completely. Shoes would be checked rigorously. Footwear designs would be catalogued. Prisoner handling would change. By keeping it rare, the Americans ensured uncertainty. This also explains why the shoe gun was issued selectively. Not to ordinary troops. Not to frontline units. But to individuals likely to be isolated, captured, and left alive. Pilots. Special operatives. Certain liaison officers. People whose missions carried high risk of capture. For these individuals, the shoe gun was not a promise. It was a backup. And backups don't need to be perfect. They just need to exist. From a psychological standpoint, the weapon may have mattered more to its carrier than to the enemy. Knowing it was there could provide confidence. A sense of agency. The idea that, even in captivity, you weren't entirely helpless. That alone could influence behavior. German intelligence likely understood this aspect as well. Which is another reason they disliked the weapon. It empowered prisoners psychologically. Even if they never used it, the possibility mattered. In German military culture, surrender and captivity carried heavy stigma. The idea that a captured enemy might still possess a weapon, however small, undermined the sense of control associated with taking prisoners. It blurred lines. And blurred lines create discomfort. American planners were comfortable with that discomfort. They were willing to introduce ambiguity into a system that relied on clarity. The shoe gun did exactly that. Critics might argue that the weapon wasted resources. Materials. Time. manufacturing effort. But compared to tanks, aircraft, and artillery, the cost was negligible. And the potential payoff, even if realized once, justified it. There's a lesson here about asymmetry. Power doesn't always scale linearly. A small, almost useless object can have outsized psychological impact if placed in the right context. The shoe gun was a masterclass in that principle. It didn't challenge German forces militarily. It challenged them conceptually. It asked an annoying question. What else are you missing? And that question lingered. In training rooms. In guard rotations. In prisoner searches. Long after the weapon itself faded into obscurity. From the American side, there was no illusion that this device would become legendary. No expectation of headlines or heroic stories. If it worked quietly, rarely, and without recognition, that was success. Which is why the shoe gun sits in such an odd place in history. Too insignificant to celebrate. Too strange to forget. German soldiers didn't take it seriously. They weren't supposed to. But they couldn't entirely dismiss it either. And in that narrow space between disbelief and awareness, the weapon fulfilled its purpose. If you look for dramatic stories involving the shoe gun, you won't find many. No famous escapes. No legendary assassinations. No after-action reports praising its effectiveness. In fact, you could search through wartime records and come away thinking the weapon never mattered at all. And that conclusion would be understandable. But it would also miss the point. Weapons are usually judged by usage. How often they were fired. How many enemies they stopped. What outcomes they produced. By those metrics, the shoe gun appears irrelevant. But intelligence tools don't follow those rules. Their success is often defined by non-events. Things that didn't happen. The shoe gun was almost never used because the conditions required to use it were extremely rare. A carrier had to be captured. They had to survive the capture. They had to retain the weapon undetected. They had to find a moment where using it made sense. Each step reduced the odds. That was known from the start. American planners were realistic. They never assumed widespread usage. They assumed occasional opportunity. Which is why the weapon didn't need to be refined or perfected. It just needed to exist. German forces, meanwhile, noticed the absence of incidents. An absence breeds skepticism. If something never shows up, it starts to feel imaginary. A theoretical threat. And soldiers are trained to prioritize reality. This skepticism fed back into German attitudes. Warnings became background noise. Footwear inspections became optional. Procedures loosened. The shoe gun slid further into irrelevance. Which paradoxically preserved its value. Because a weapon that is ignored is easier to use than one that is feared. The Americans understood that. And so did German intelligence, at least intellectually. But intellect doesn't always override fatigue. As the war dragged on, German soldiers were overwhelmed by real dangers. Bombing raids. Artillery barrages. Encirclements. Partisan attacks. Compared to those threats, a single hidden shot in a shoe felt laughable. And so it was treated that way. There is another reason usage was minimal. Escape attempts themselves were rare. Not because prisoners lacked motivation, but because the risks were enormous. Recapture often meant punishment. Failure could mean death. Many prisoners waited for the war to end. In those cases, the shoe gun was never even considered. For those who did attempt escape, firearms were rarely the deciding factor. Disguises. Bribes. Forgery. Geography. Those mattered far more. The shoe gun was, at best, a contingency. And contingencies rarely get used. But when they do, they change outcomes disproportionately. That's the logic intelligence agencies operate on. German records suggest that most escape attempts relied on deception rather than violence. Which further reduced the need for a concealed weapon. A gun, even a tiny one, Creates noise. Noise attracts attention. Attention ruins escape attempts. So even when available, the shoe gun may have been intentionally unused. This reinforces the weapon's misunderstood nature. It wasn't a tool of action. It was a tool of reassurance. From the German side, this only deepened frustration. They were asked to worry about something that never seemed to happen. A threat that existed mostly on paper. In a war defined by brutal realities, paper threats felt like distractions. Yet intelligence agencies don't operate on emotion. They operate on margins. Even a 1% chance matters if the stakes are high. Consider the alternative. If even a single German guard were injured or killed because a prisoner produced a hidden weapon, the psychological impact would ripple outward. Searches would tighten. Trust would erode. Procedures would harden. That possibility alone justified the weapon's existence. The fact that it didn't happen often is irrelevant. The fact that it could happen was enough. German soldiers, understandably, didn't think that way. They lived in the present. They dealt with what was in front of them. And what was in front of them was rarely a shoe gun. This mismatch in perspective explains why the weapon was disliked rather than feared. Fear comes from experience. Dislike comes from inconvenience. The shoe gun inconvenienced German forces by existing in theory. By forcing them to consider absurdities. By introducing doubt where none was wanted. There is also the issue of symbolism. The shoe gun represented American adaptability. A willingness to bend rules. To blur lines between civilian objects and weapons. German doctrine, especially earlier in the war, preferred clear distinctions. Uniforms. Weapons. Roles. The shoe gun violated all of that. It suggested that anything could be a weapon. And that idea is unsettling. As the war neared its end, the shoe gun faded further into obscurity. More pressing concerns took over. Entire units were surrendering. Infrastructure collapsed. At that stage, hidden weapons in shoes barely registered. After the war, historians largely ignored the shoe gun. It didn't fit into heroic narratives. It didn't influence strategy. It didn't leave a clear trail of consequences. But absence from history doesn't equal irrelevance. It simply means the weapon did exactly what it was supposed to do. Work quietly. Leave no obvious trace. German soldiers didn't take it seriously. And from a tactical standpoint, they were right. It wasn't serious. It wasn't meant to be. Its value lay elsewhere. In the discomfort it caused. In the uncertainty it introduced. In the irritation it produced. Those are not glamorous effects. They don't show up on maps or casualty lists. But they matter. And that is why the shoe gun deserves attention. Not as a weapon of war, but as a tool of mindset. History tends to remember war in extremes. The biggest battles. The most destructive weapons. The loudest moments. Everything else fades into the background. The shoe gun lives in that background. Not because it failed, but because it never tried to be important. When people look back at World War II, they search for decisive tools. Tanks that broke through lines. Aircraft that dominated skies. Weapons that force surrender. The shoe gun does none of that. And so it's easy to dismiss. Just as German soldiers did. But dismissal is not the same as irrelevance. The shoe gun operated on a different layer of warfare, one that rarely receives attention. The layer of pressure. Pressure doesn't destroy. It accumulates. It manifests as hesitation, distraction, second-guessing. It wears down systems designed for efficiency. The German military, like any large organization, depended on routine. Procedures. Checklists. Predictable sequences. The shoe gun disrupted those routines, slightly, quietly, persistently. Not enough to force change. But enough to irritate. German soldiers didn't fear the weapon. They didn't respect it. They didn't even believe in it most of the time. But they knew it might exist. And might is powerful. The true success of the shoe gun was psychological asymmetry. America invested minimal resources. Germany spent mental effort dealing with it. That imbalance matters. This is where history often misjudges weapons. We look for outcomes. We look for numbers. We look for impact we can measure. The shoe gun offers none of that. Instead, it offers insight into how wars are fought beyond the battlefield, into how irritation can be strategic, into how being underestimated can be useful. German forces disliked the shoe gun not because it harmed them, but because it challenged their expectations. It suggested that the enemy was willing to break conventions, that no object was too mundane. That certainty was dangerous. In a war defined by industrial power, this tiny, almost useless device represented something uncomfortable. Flexibility. The shoe gun was not a symbol of American strength. It was a symbol of American mindset. Adaptable. Improvisational. Unconcerned with elegance. That mindset frustrated German planners far more than the weapon itself. After the war, surviving German soldiers rarely mentioned the shoe gun. Why would they? It didn't shape their experience. It didn't define their struggle. It was just annoying. An annoyance doesn't make history books. But it makes systems less efficient. It makes people cut corners. It introduces friction. The shoe gun forced German soldiers to consider absurdities in the middle of a very serious war. That alone was disruptive. There's a lesson hidden here. Power is not always about force. Sometimes, it's about presence. About being just noticeable enough to matter. The shoe gun was never meant to be admired. It was never meant to be feared. It was meant to exist. Quietly. Stubbornly. Inconveniently. German soldiers didn't take it seriously. And that was fine. Because taking it seriously was never the objective. The objective was doubt. A moment of hesitation. A lingering thought. And in that narrow space, between disbelief and awareness, the shoe gun did exactly what it was designed to do. History tends to remember war in extremes. The biggest battles. The most destructive weapons. The loudest moments. Everything else fades into the background. The shoe gun lives in that background. Not because it failed, but because it never tried to be important. When people look back at World War II, they search for decisive tools. Tanks that broke through lines. Aircraft that dominated skies. Weapons that force surrender. The shoe gun does none of that. And so it's easy to dismiss. Just as German soldiers did. But dismissal is not the same as irrelevance. The shoe gun operated on a different layer of warfare, one that rarely receives attention. The layer of pressure. Pressure doesn't destroy. It accumulates. It manifests as hesitation, distraction, second-guessing. It wears down systems designed for efficiency. The German military, like any large organization, depended on routine. Procedures. Checklists. Predictable sequences. The shoe gun disrupted those routines, slightly, quietly, persistently. Not enough to force change. But enough to irritate. German soldiers didn't fear the weapon. They didn't respect it. They didn't even believe in it most of the time. But they knew it might exist. And might is powerful. The true success of the shoe gun was psychological asymmetry. America invested minimal resources. Germany spent mental effort dealing with it. That imbalance matters. This is where history often misjudges weapons. We look for outcomes. We look for numbers. We look for impact we can measure. The shoe gun offers none of that. Instead, it offers insight into how wars are fought beyond the battlefield, into how irritation can be strategic, into how being underestimated can be useful. German forces disliked the Shu gun not because it harmed them, but because it challenged their expectations. It suggested that the enemy was willing to break conventions. That no object was too mundane. That certainty was dangerous. In a war defined by industrial power, this tiny, almost useless device represented something uncomfortable. Flexibility. The Shu gun was not a symbol of American strength. It was a symbol of American mindset. Adaptable. Improvisational. Unconcerned with elegance. That mindset frustrated German planners far more than the weapon itself. After the war, surviving German soldiers rarely mentioned the Shu gun. Why would they? It didn't shape their experience. It didn't define their struggle. It was just annoying. An annoyance doesn't make history books. But it makes systems less efficient. It makes people cut corners. It introduces friction. The Shu gun forced German soldiers to consider absurdities in the middle of a very serious war. That alone was disruptive. There's a lesson hidden here. Power is not always about force. Sometimes, it's about presence. About being just noticeable enough to matter. The Shu gun was never meant to be admired. It was never meant to be feared. It was meant to exist. Quietly. Stubbornly. Inconveniently. German soldiers didn't take it seriously. And that was fine. Because taking it seriously was never the objective. The objective was doubt. A moment of hesitation. A lingering thought. And in that narrow space, between disbelief and awareness, the Shu gun did exactly what it was designed to do.